The NFC East has QBs galore and many other skill positions that are relevant to our fantasy football. A team last year that I think surprised us, Tom, as far as their fantasy relevance and being interesting to watch. Let's start with the New York Giants and their new franchise quarterback.
I'm going to go with that. Yeah, definitely. Jackson, Trump Dart. People are quite down on him at the moment, aren't they, because of that meeting with Trump? But actually, he has really shown some talent. Last year's, I would say, most exciting breakout quarterback, and perhaps one of the big candidates for it this year. He rushes, and we know rushing wins leagues. He's shown he's got that elite upside. Can he stay fit? Last year in his rookie season, 2,272 passing yards, 15 touchdowns. 487 rushing yards, 9 rushing touchdowns, 20.5 points per game. Only 5 ints, which isn't really that bad when you consider he's a rookie. And that was just in 12 starts. I would say that rushing production is really sort of what matters. You're not drafting him for as a safe QB. You're really going for it. I think if you take him, it's because of that rushing profile. He's like Allen, he's like Daniels, he's like May, and if he can make that year 2 leap, I think he'll be a top 8 QB.
My worry is, I think it was such a surprise to the league, it seems, having that year of tape on that time soon is how does that potentially limit him? It didn't take him long to overthrow. Dangerous at all. That wasn't much of a surprise that Wilson didn't stick around too long. But what we haven't seen is whether Jackson Dart is limited in his fancy output in the same way that Russell Wilson was unlimited in what he could do. So yeah, I'm really excited. Of the players you can take around that point, he absolutely has the highest ceiling. The worry is he potentially has the lowest floor as well. That will be the Jackson Dart experience this year. And I think that's going to be very similar for his running buddy alongside him. A player that seems to have no regard whatsoever for his physical safety and thinks his head is a weapon. And that's why we love to watch him, Cam Skattebo.
Yeah, I mean, is he the biggest risk-reward player in fantasy football this year?
I worry about him.
Yeah, genuinely.
I'm just going, Cam, can we just calm down?
I mean, he's obviously playing up to this, the image a little bit, isn't he?
Yeah.
But you saw the backflip and these. You're thinking, what
are you doing? It's a fun.
Just stop. It's like Rice. Another one like Rice. Just stop.
There was for our American listeners, there was a Man United winger, Lewis Nani, who played for Man United a number of years ago, who Alex Ferguson stand on the sideline, just rolling his eyes out and tutting and getting furious at every time he did a backflip celebrate. It was a spectacular backflip, but quite hamstring heavy, I think, on the land. So yeah, I'm sure people have spoken to Cam about looking after his body a little bit more. But anyway, fancy relevance.
So obviously last year he had an absolutely devastating, and it was pretty horrendous injury. If anybody saw that, don't search it up. Would be my advice. It was not a particularly nice one. And he looked like an absolute superstar. Really, he took the backfield very quickly. If he's healthy, he's probably got that RB1 upside. He only played 8 games last year, but he had 101 carries, 410 rushing yards, 5 touchdowns. He was taking receiving work as well with 24 receptions for 207 yards, 2 receiving touchdowns. And from sort of weeks 2 to 7, he was the true feature back. Within that time period, he's getting 19.5 touches per game. And he was the RB8 overall. Currently on Sleeper, he's kind of between sort of RB15 to RB20, so kind of around round 3 or round 4 pick. He's an upside RB2, and if he's fully healthy, the workload could be absolutely enormous. It's the rushing and the pass catching. We know that's fancy goal when it comes to RBs. I think the only reason he's not gone much higher is the injury concerns and the concern about his recovery.
Yeah, and I think what needs to be said as well is he got that RB9 in points per game in the first 8 games of the season. That is so rare that a rookie running back comes out and kind of hits the ground running quite literally at the start of their career. We didn't see it from Hampton. We didn't see it from Genty. We didn't see it from Henderson. It was Cam Skattebo. No, it was Cam Skattebo that was absolutely immediate impact. who knows if that would have carried on through the rest of the season. What we were worried about, though, while it was going, as people said, is he looking after his body? Could he get injured? I don't think the injury that he had wasn't necessarily that, but he is a high risk player and that has to count into it. So I'm going to say when Cam Skattebo gets injured, we'll keep an eye out for Tyrone Tracy.
Because he is one of the best handcuffs in fantasy football. Yeah. And he is, Skattebo, it doesn't even need to be horrendous injury. It could be concussion, something like that. You feel that Tracy's going to get some weeks on the field. Now, the Giants obviously aren't that keen on him because they took Skattebo, and I think Skattebo will be the lead back. But if he goes down, Tracy has shown, that he can do it. He had 11 starts last year, and across 15 games, he beat 1,000 yards, 1,028, 212 total touches, 4 touchdowns. He finishes the RB 28. So, yes, he's only got you 10.6 points per game. He's not elite. He's going as the RB 44 on Sleeper, so 121st overall. I wouldn't be taking him for standalone value, but if I've got Skattebo, take him as a handcuff 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we move on to wide receiver, please do subscribe, like, give us a share, drop a comment below. Are you targeting Cam Skattebo, or are you too worried about how he uses his head to part fully grown men who stand in his path? Malik Neighbours, when we're talking about injuries, it's his injury that makes... I honestly don't know where to land on Neighbours, because it was so clear-cut what we were getting at the start of last season, and that injury took that straight away from us.
Yeah, I've literally got my notes. One of the toughest players to rank in fantasy football this season. On talent alone, he's a top 5 wide receiver. There's no question about that, really. But he's returning from a torn ACL and meniscus injury. So it's pretty horrific injury. He only played 4 games. If we look at his stats before, he was totally dominant, really, within their backfield. 35 targets, 18 receptions, 271 yards, 2 touchdowns, 27% target share, and the wide receiver 9 in points per game prior to injury. It's just difficult with him, isn't it, really? He's shown he's got the quality and he can do it. Is he the best? Is he probably the best league-winning receiver going outside of round 2? That would be my question for you. He's got elite talent, right? He's got that target share. He's young. He's got a QB who should hopefully only get better. I think he's definitely got wide receiver 1 upside. It's just the injury, right?
100%. I think the worry is there's always going to be someone in a league drafting with me that is less worried about his injury comeback than I am. So I don't think I'm going to get him anywhere. I'm glad I've got a couple of shares of him in Dynasty, because I'm going to get to see some of the benefit of that when it comes to it. But yeah, redraft, I just don't think I'm going to get him, because he's going just that little bit too high for what I've got the guts to pick him on. There is absolutely a way, though, that he comes back last season and go, oh yeah, what injury? I just don't see the sort of player he is, how explosive a runner he is. That's that pure speed and acceleration. I don't think is possible for us to see after such a bad knee injury last year.
Boo. It's all I can say. Boo. Yeah. Boo.
I genuinely hope I'm wrong. I've never wanted to be wrong as much about that from a fancy point of view. Partly because, God, what else can you pick from the receiving core for the Giants?
Well, we won't spend hours discussing these because
I don't think we could.
None of
if
them.
We tried, I'm not sure we could spend hours.
Mooney had the odd week when he was in Atlanta, didn't he? Where he looked all right. Didn't really. I think he had a couple of weeks because he was in Chicago originally. I want to say. I think he had a couple of weeks in Chicago. Slayton's just seems to have been around forever. Calvin Austin III is just not great. So I'm not really interested in any of these 3. Not even in best ball, to be honest. I mean, I'm sure there'll be the odd week where one of them will get a touchdown or 2. But they're just... actually, for me, the next man is much more interesting than these guys.
Oh, when it comes to those targets, Isaiah is far more likely to get a share of those than anyone else. Obviously, I'm a little bit biased with him being an ex-Raven. I'm really glad to see him landing in a spot where he's going to get a chance to make that position his own. It can't be forgotten that it's John Harbaugh that has bought him in. The man who knows him best has bought him in. Does that mean anything for fantasy, though?
Certainly, I think it does. He'll be a really, really interesting one. As you said, he was stuck behind Andrews, but he really did show flashes. I think he's one of the most intriguing tight ends this year. 4 seasons in the league, so he does. He knows how to play at this level. He finally, as you say, gets his chance to be that clear tight end one under the manager who, did he draft him? Did the GM draft him? But they work together on these things, don't they? So they won't have taken him there without a plan for him. His final season in Baltimore, yes, that was disappointing. But, injury plagued, 27 receptions, 307 yards, just the 1 touchdown. But he missed time with a foot injury that actually ended up requiring surgery. So it was fairly serious. No turf toe here. So current sleeper ADP is going as the tight end 12 to 14, so around 100. Around player literally 100 overall. So typically sort of the 9th to 10th round in 12-team leagues. He's one of my favorite tight end targets, late round tight end targets anyway. You're not playing for his ceiling at all. You're definitely drafting him at his floor there. It is realistic that he could have a top 8 finish in terms of tight end with that full-time role. Could get this totally wrong, but I do. He's shown flashes certainly when he's been in Baltimore.
Yeah, that's why I've got him as that breakout candidate. We didn't see as much from him last year as we have done previously. He is an absolutely fantastic target in the red zone, though, on those shorter passing opportunities from the red zone. So I think we will see some touch. And I think we'll see him being a target that Dart really enjoys using as well. He is the number 1 tight end target. I think my worry is Andrews hasn't been far enough in his last couple of years, and we didn't see Likely take it over. But I would assume John Harbaugh knows better than I do. So when we think about it, the fact he's taking him, the fact he's there, means there's a clear role for him. So yeah, he is a breakout candidate for me. I'm start of season as streamable tight end. I am more than happy to be proven wrong with that though, because we've not seen him in his own right having the offense designed around him individually as the tight end. And that's what we're going to get this year. So yeah, as far as players you'll be taking around that point, if you would take him and TJ Hawkinson as your 2 late tight ends, you're quite happy with that.
I've got another tight end we'll come on to in a little while.
Let's move on then to our next team in the NFC East, and that is a team with another exciting quarterback. That is the Washington Commanders, and they've also had a little bit of movement this week prior to us recording at wide receiver as well. So let's kick off then with Jaden Daniels.
One of the highest upside quarterbacks in fantasy football. Really disappointing season last year, but hugely injury filled. Watch a quarterback on Netflix. If no sponsorship there, but it is an interesting show if you want to get a bit more insight into him. I think people have forgotten about his spectacular rookie campaign. He's still being drafted quite early, so he's still a top 5 QB in terms of draft. 2025. Largely lost to injury, missed 10 games, dealt with knee, hamstring, elbow, and other injuries. He played only 7 games overall. Yes, his completion rate fell. But let's just focus back to that rookie season. Yes, he perhaps won't get to those heights again, but 3,568 passing yards, 25 touchdowns, nearly 891 rushing yards, 6 rushing touchdowns. He has league-winning upside. And for me, I'm getting him cheaper than Allen. I'm getting him cheaper than Jackson. I've taken him in a couple of places. There's no question, I think, in terms of his talent. The question is his health. If he plays those 17 games, I think he's capable of being the QB1. I'm going to say it. I think he is capable of being the QB1. I don't think he'll be Allen, but he's capable.
He's an outsider, but yeah, he's one of the small handful that have got the potential for that. And I think his slightly improved receiving core is going to help that as well. Obviously, a familiar target in McLaurin, but a couple of additions to that as well, hasn't he?
Yes, so obviously Scary Terry returns, another bounce back candidate. We seem to talk about loads of them this year. That big breakout in 2024, and then injuries and the struggling Commanders offense that really sort of tanked last year. Led to his difficulties and his struggles. I think the good news is his underlying metrics are still excellent. And, it suggests that the talent hasn't disappeared for him. 10 games last year, 38 receptions, 582 yards, just the 3 touchdowns, and finished as wide receiver 56. because that's his career low in terms of yards and touchdowns. But again, there are injuries there. If we go back another year, 82 receptions, 1,096 yards, 13 touchdowns, wide receiver 7. So that was one of the best seasons of his career. So I think as a wide receiver 2 target, he's going sort of around, round 4, round 5. I think as a wide receiver 2 target, you can do a lot worse. You're getting a proven 1,000-yard receiver at a big discount because everyone's thinking about last year, and his injuries and the quarterback's injuries. So I think, if Daniel stays healthy, because that's going to be a big factor, McLaurin will easily outperform his price.
And a player that is 100% going to outperform their price we've been paying so far, a player that I have picked up in almost every best ball draft we have done so far, a player that you criticised me for, asking why I picked him in one of our best ball leagues, Tom. It was obvious he was going to land on a team. It seemed obvious he was going to land on the Commanders. He has landed in the Commanders. No, we're not going to get elite Stephon Diggs, or are we? Depending on what you think. But his ADP is about to change significantly compared to what we have been playing prior to this week.
Yeah. I mean, the hands up. I was wrong, obviously. Personally, I wouldn't have him on my team. He seems like a bit of a bad egg. But what do I know? I'm not a NFL GM. So one of the more interesting veterans this year, I think. People think he's washed. He's 33, right? He can't do it anymore. But actually, his production last year showed he's still got quite a lot left in the tank. Yes, these things can drop off quickly, but he had a 1,000-yard season in New England. Is he with a better quarterback? That's debatable. I think May's very, very talented quarterback. But if we look at his stats, 85 receptions, 1,013 yards, receiving yards, 4 touchdowns, 102 targets played, all 17 games. He finished about the wide receiver 23. This year, he's going as his current ADP is the wide receiver. Although this is obviously going to change because he's signed for a team, but his current ADP at the time of writing was between sort of 53 and 63. So going around sort of 11 and 12s. I think, you've got real value there for him where you've taken him. And I think he still is value at the moment. You're basically drafting him as a bench receiver. But, the likelihood of you getting at least wide receiver 3 numbers out of them for the cost is incredibly high. Yes, you're not going to get Buffalo era Stephon Diggs. He is a lot older than that, but he's reliable, and even if you just take him that late and plug him in for bye weeks, I think he's a bit of a bargain, really.
Yeah, I agree. I'm very happy to have him at the price I paid for him everywhere so far. That price is gone. I think people can start overpaying this bit because we have a little bubble now. Everyone gets very excited again. And I agree with you. No, we're not going to see the best of Stephon Diggs. I'm not drafting him to be my wide receiver 2 anywhere. That would make no sense to me. I wouldn't be wanting to pick him. If I was picking him as my wide receiver 3, I'd be a little bit worried. I'd like him to be my 4th or 5th wide receiver, so he is an option there to go in my flex spot, and he will repay that more often than not this year, but also be prepared to have those fallow weeks as well. I'm really interested to see what you have to say about the next player, a player that I have banged the drum for year after year after year, and I have not been right once yet.
Mr. Chig Okonkwo. That's right. Yeah, that is right. Yeah. So I think, again, we've talked a lot about tight ends, but I think he's a good value. One of these guys has got to hit, right? We talked about loads of tight ends who are good.
They can't all be good values, can they? At some point, they're going to be the value.
Yeah. I think I think he's one of the better late round sleepers really here. He spent his career in Tennessee. Inconsistent quarterback play. I think he's definitely got the best quarterback of his career so far in Daniels. We look at his stats last year, 55 receptions, 560 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns, 79 targets. He finished as the tight end 22. Okay, so that's not great. And his average since he's been in the league since 2023, 54, 52, and 56 receptions. So he's mid-tier, and he's looked mid-tier. His current ADP is around tight end 18 to 24. He's going 146th overall on Sleeper. If you're going to wait, this is exactly the type of tight end to wait for. Yes, it's a gamble. All right, he's not going to give you Bowers or McBride numbers, but at that cost, he could be an absolute bargain. My question for you would be, is he the number 2 target in Washington? Because I think he very likely could be.
No, I think it's the number 3 target. At the minute, could that change over the course of the season? Yes, it could, because Okonkwo could be far better under an actual decent quarterback for the first time in his career, and Diggs could be done. And there's a reason it's taken him so long to find a team that, say, GMs know better than us on. I think Okonkwo is a player I've massively got to put my own biases to one side on, because you look back at stats, and actually when he was targeted more reliably, he had top 12 weeks. He then just wasn't targeted in some games. I'm looking back at his stats from last year. He's had a high of, he had weeks 15 to 17 targeted 10, 11, then 7 times. But week 10 to 12, he was targeted once, then 4 times, then once. We've not seen him consistently used in a game plan. I think that's more of a Tennessee thing than an Okonkwo thing. So, yeah, I don't think I'm going to get him, because there are other players I feel happier about drafting, but I would happily be wrong on this as well, mainly to prove me right for the previous 4 years when I have drafted him everywhere. This will be the year I go out on him, so this is the year he will hit. Where we've got some real, I don't know, confusion, doubt, mudness of the waters, we've got a tricky running back situation in Washington. I've put Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt in for, he was the fancy darling of rookie drafts last year, and then that crept into redraft as well, and it just didn't really happen at any point properly in season on a consistent basis.
No, I'd agree with you. You know, quite a polarizing player. I mean, he had a couple of spike weeks, and people kind of went crazy for him on the waiver wire, didn't they? You know, some, again, when I do my research, you know, quite a few people sort of see him as a breakout candidate. I see him more, again, as some other sort of analysts see him, as a committee back, really, who's going to lose touches. They've got an interesting backfield. The next man, obviously, come on to talk about is Rashad White. There's also Jerome Ford there, and then Katron Allen, the rookie. So I don't really see any of them sort of taking a lead here. That's my worry, really.
And when it comes to the receiving work, Rashad White seems the most surefire player to be getting the passing downs as well, doesn't he? I think they're going so close to each other. I can't remember who we were talking about on our previous show where they're going very close to each other. But when 2 running backs in a committee are going so close in ADP, lower down anyway, to me that says when one has a good week, the other won't, and vice versa. And I think that's what we're going to have with these two. So I think I will probably steer well clear.
Yeah, I would agree. Really. So I haven't spent ages going in terms of stats and notes, because I just think it's a really muddy backfield. I mean, even Ford could pop up. I mean, I haven't done much in terms of the rookie Allen, but Jerome Ford's shown at points that he can also pop in and steal stuff. I think Merritt should be pretty safe for the goal line rushers, which could give him a bit more favor. But as you say, White's very, very light to get that passing work. So, you know, we could get some passing touchdowns, or certainly some yardage there, which could bump his numbers. But yeah, I would try to avoid these two if I could. But obviously, needs must. Sometimes you've got to take them.
Next up, a team that have given us fancy points galore over the years, but were a little bit quieter last year than we have seen previously. The Philadelphia Eagles. How confident are we feeling about Jalen Hurts? Is he still in that top tier of quarterbacks, or are we softening on him a little bit?
A difficult one, you know, very, very debatable. So I think on one hand, you know, he's been an absolute fantasy superstar, hasn't he, at points? On the other hand, last year was his weakest season since becoming Philadelphia's full-time starter, you know, and he enters 2026 with a new OC and without AJ Brown. You know, last year being poor, he still got you 19.1 points per game. He still had 25 passing touchdowns. He still rushed, which is obviously the big thing with him, for 412 yards, and he still rushed for 8 touchdowns. So kind of finished QB 8 to 9, depending on the format that you've taken him in. The biggest concern, obviously, was that rushing decline. He hasn't rushed anywhere near as much as he has. But will his new OC look to sort of pull that back? I think he's still an elite fantasy quarterback because of his rushing. You know, and even in that bad year, he still finished as a QB1. If they design more runs for him and go back to him, you know, he could easily jump back in that same tier for me as Allen, Jackson, and I would even put Daniels within there. I just don't think at the minute he's quite there for me.
I think he was better than people gave him credit for last year. People were talking like he was awful last year. I think he just didn't repay the QB for ADP. I think last year, people are the ADP for quarterbacks is lower than it was last year. I think we're seeing Josh Allen go late 2 at the early round 3. We're seeing Lamar go around round 4. We're seeing Hurts go off much later as previously. Whereas last year, it was quite frequent. You'd see Josh Allen go round 1, Lamar Jackson go some point round 2, and people might then panic and pull the trigger on Jalen Hurts end of round 3, early round 4. Yes, from that value, he let you down. Realistically, where he should have been drafted, where his ADP should have been putting him, he still had a decent season. 19.1 points per game. Once again, you can't sniff at that. 8 top 12 finishes is really consistent QB numbers when you look at the fact that he had some of those big weeks as well. I'm putting him QB4, but once again, there's a little bit of a mix there where depending on Burrow, May, Hurts, Daniels, they're in that little movable band for me that I'm not quite settled on yet. I think it's going to depend on other players around him, as it always does for QB. And Saquon Barkley had such a quiet year last year. A reminder for everyone doing their drafts, I think we did it as a feature last year. I can't remember when the time, if it would ever happen, that a fancy RB1 or the other player, fancy player 1 overall, had repeated that. The workload, the strength schedule last year predicted that Saquon would be quieter last year. As quiet as he was, were we expecting that?
No. I mean, obviously, we're looking for a regression. We're expecting some, but I don't think the way he sort of floundered, really. I mean, it's a bit of a harsh word, but he struggled last year compared to what we have seen him from. He's definitely no longer a top 3 consensus pick, but he's still one of the most talented running backs in the league. And he had those historic 2024 numbers. So, yes, he is probably, we're expecting him to regress after that. Last year, just 317 touches, just 1,413 yards.
Rubbish.
Terrible. It is for him. For him, it isn't good.
Yeah.
RB 14 in points per game. So, 7 touchdowns. Yards per carry dropped roughly 4.1. It was those explosive plays, I really think, that, he didn't have those kind of monster games that he had the year before. If we talk about 2024, 2,005 rushing yards, 15 total touchdowns, 22.1 points per game. Obviously, the overall RB1. He was a monster and a league winner to some degree the season before. He's obviously older now. He's currently going kind of anything between round sort of 8 to 11. Going RB8 to RB11. So around 14th overall. Usually drafted late first or early second. He's a bounce back candidate. I don't think he'll get another 2,000 yard season. I think he's done in terms of 2,000 yard seasons. But I also don't think that his RB14 finish last year tells the whole story with him. And I think, with the offense improved, he still should have elite volume. I think we'll see a slight uptick from last year. But I don't predict a 2,000 yard season.
No, of course not. And the supporting cast behind him, Will Shipley, is of no concern. Tank Bigsby, interesting as far as acquisition goes. Not a Saquon threat, but Bigsby is one to watch out for, potentially getting a little bit of work. And if Saquon does miss any time, Bigsby will be an interesting prospect, won't he?
Yeah, I do think if Saquon goes down, it will be a bit more of a committee between those two. But I think Bigsby will certainly be the 1A. Of the two and see more of the work. He's had problems with fumbles, hasn't he? So that you've got to question him, really.
I am really excited this season for the Slim Reaper to be the wide receiver 1 in Philadelphia. What are you thinking about Devonta Smith's outlook for this year with AJ Brown out the way? You better get to the library quicker, won't you? Because obviously AJ Brown won't be in there hogging all that knowledge and literature like he was doing previously.
Has he got the best nickname in fantasy football? Is that the best
It's
nickname
up
in the
there.
NFL? The Slim Reaper?
It's
It's got to be close, hasn't it?
the way that Jalen Hurts says it. Well, Jalen Hurts is a very smooth talking young man, and when he talks about Slim Reaper, I could melt listening to Jalen Hurts say anything. Anyway, Devonta Smith fancy outlook.
So 2025 stats: 77 receptions, 1,008 receiving yards, 4 touchdowns, 113 targets. That was his third 1,000-yard plus season. And remember, he was playing out opposite AJ Brown, who hogged a large amount of target share and threw a tantrum when he didn't get the ball thrown to him. His current ADP, anything from sort of wide receiver 13 to wide receiver 16. So he's going around 30, anything from 33 to 45 overall. So usually he's drafted in round 3 or 4. I like you. I'm very high on him this year. I think the vacated targets. I don't think Hurts is he's obviously not the best passing quarterback, but he's serviceable, and I think Smith takes that target, the majority of that target share. He will be the true wide receiver 1. The talent's never been in question. It's really been about volume with him. So yeah, I'm very high on him this year.
We talk about nicknames, and after seeing Mekhi Lemon's snake hips during his interviews, where he was kind of sulking around screen, Mekhi Lemon is a player I'm sure is going to give himself a nickname at some point this year. Is he going to work his way into fancy relevance for us, though? Because regardless of how he's come across interviews, what a talent to watch during the draft process.
Yeah, I think he is one of the most intriguing rookie wide receivers, really, in fantasy football this year. They traded up to take him in the first round. He obviously AJ Brown's gone. There's a lot more targets. He has a real good, true path to being the wide receiver 2 within that offense. I don't think he'll outplay Smith. I think Smith is a real talent, but certainly likely to take that wide receiver 2 role. Obviously, no sort of previous NFL production, but in terms of college, 79 receptions. This is 2025. 79 receptions, 1,156 receiving yards, 11 touchdowns, 3.13 yards per route run, and high target share. I mean, scouts talk about he can win at all 3 levels. He creates separation. He is a real talent. Where's he going, in terms of draft? So current ADP, he's around 40 to 42, so sort of 95th overall. So you take him in rounds 8 and 9. He's a risk. All rookies are risks. But he does have that realistic, easy path becoming a mid-season starter and perhaps wide receiver 2 within the offense by mid-season. If you're getting him in round sort of 8 to 10, obviously he's not safe like Devonta Smith. But he has significantly greater upside than pretty much any other receiver you're going to take at that point, apart from the Packers ones.
I mean, what's interesting is that we're not as joined up enough to kind of prepare the graphics alongside you doing your notes, and we've kind of landed on that same point that we're looking ahead into the season for seeing what he's got to offer, which is what happens a lot of the time with wide receivers anyway. So I put bench stash with wide receiver 2 potential. I agree with you. I think by the time we get to that end of October time, I think we could really be seeing the best of him. And I think what I'm most optimistic for is where he's being drafted at the moment is cheap enough that if he has a very quiet weeks 1 to 5, people might drop him.
Yeah,
if people aren't quite as clear, or if there is that hotness on the waiver wire that someone wants and needs to free someone up. He's a player that we could see dropped in some leagues. I don't think most of our leagues we play in, people are too clued up to do that, but keep an eye on him because if someone does drop him, grab him immediately. I don't think it's possible that we get to the end of the season without him having had fancy relevance, especially in that second half. And obviously that's the business end of it. We're in our fancy playoffs. He could be a great pickup at that stage. And what I think helps that is that the only real receiving threat then comes from tight end, doesn't it?
Yeah, and for me, we mentioned tight ends earlier. This is the man I was talking about. I've tried to get him late on in lots of our best ball drafts because I think he could be on for a big wedge of that AJ Brown target share. So Dallas Goedert, as I say, one of the best values this year. Everyone's chasing those younger breakouts. So I want Colston Loveland. I want Trey McBride, but actually Goddard's coming off arguably one of his best seasons in terms of fantasy. And say there's lots more targets there. So last year, 60 receptions, 591 receiving yards, 11 touchdowns, finishes the Titans 6th in fantasy points per game. At the moment, ADP wise, he's going anything from the Titan 9th to Titan 15, but he's going 118th overall. So drafting that 10th to 12th round. As I said, I've tried to take him quite a lot in our best ball drafts. At that price, I don't need him to repeat his 11 touchdown season to be valuable. If he just produced me steady points each week, he's going to do well. And yes, it's a gamble, but there is a large chunk of target share available there.
Absolutely. I think my only concern is, looking at the Eagles' strength of schedule, I think there are going to be more games where they're about done and they'll run the ball and they won't need to pass it as much, and that will impact Goddard as well. I've got him as a streamable tight end option because he sits. I think we'll 100% will have some of those top 12 games again, but I just don't think it's going to come week in, week out. And I don't think he is matchup proof in the way that some tight ends are. But I also agree with everything you said. I think if you've got him and you've got then someone to plug in when it is those trickier matchups, more often than not, it's going to be Goddard that you're going to be starting.
Yeah. Shall we move on and look at the final team?
Let's do those Cowboys.
So, yes, Dallas.
I was really surprised last year that when we're speaking about Dak, we were quite optimistic about Dak's season last year, as were other pockets. But on the whole, people were really, really down on Dak. I would say 75% of what you saw was negative about Dak. And I started to doubt what we were thinking was going to happen. I don't often blow our own trumpet. We got it bang on for Dak last year. And I just see more of the same. As long as he stays fit, he is fantasy relevant, and he has got some of the most consistent receiving weapons around him at the moment.
Yeah, and even some of those are a surprise, really. I mean, for me, Dak is one of the best value quarterbacks this year. He's not those big names, all right? He doesn't offer that rushing production. But in terms of passing and passing volumes and the weapons around him, mid-round QBs, there aren't many better. He silenced the doubters last year. I'm gonna say it. 4,552 passing yards, 30 passing touchdowns. All right, there's 10 interceptions there. We know he's always good for an interception. But, he played all 17 games as well, which had a big effect on the year before the injury. And he finishes a top 7 fantasy QB in points per game. They threw the ball a lot. That is a factor we need to consider. They were forced to throw to a lot because they struggled in terms of defense. But that will have had an effect and a help on his overall scoring. But I still think he's got it in him. Typically drafted anything from sort of the QB7 to the QB10, available in rounds 7 to 9. You're going to take him after Allen, after Jackson, after Daniels, after Drake May. But if you're waiting on a QB, there aren't many safer options really than Dak. He's not going to give you those massive 800-yard rushing seasons, but he could easily throw for 4,000 plus yards, and 30 touchdowns if his two main receivers are healthy.
Completely agree with you. I think he's getting a place where I'm very interested in picking up Dak. He seems to have his doubters yet again, but you look at the receivers around him, and what was a quiet year for CD Lamb, still a good season by most standards, but if we see the best of Lamb again this year, and we see more of the same from Pickens, that can only bode well for Dak when you talk about that passing volume.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if Lamb can get back to how he has been, who knows how they can do. So CD enters 2026 as one of probably the safest elite wide receivers in fantasy football. And I think he is still elite. It was a down year by his standards. Injuries had a big role in that. And if you draft him as a top 6 wide receiver, yes, you're going to be slightly disappointed. But he really does have that bounce back potential. Even with a dip, 75 receptions, 1,077 receiving yards, 3 touchdowns, but he only played 14 games, and struggled in a number of those games with injury. Finished outside the elite wide receiver tier. There was some bad luck in there as well. And despite his low fantasy finish, he still had another 1,000-yard plus season. So he's got a streak of 1,000-yard plus seasons. Currently ADP, he's going as a wide receiver 5 or 6. So he's selected either late first or early second. And he is a foundational fantasy wide receiver 1, I think. So if you're going to take him in your team, you shouldn't have many concerns there. If I'm drafting at the end of round 1 and the top running backs are gone, I don't think he's necessarily a bad pick. He's not Chase, he's not Jefferson, we know that. But he's firmly in that sort of next tier down, I would say. And he's an excellent chance to finish as a top 5 receiver if he plays the full season.
Ed and I spoke when we were doing the AFC North show about how the Bengals are one of the few teams potentially to have who could get 2 wide receivers into the top 12 in Chase and Higgins. The Cowboys are another. I was completely wrong about George Pickens. I ridiculed the positivity around him and could not have got it more wrong, because what we saw last year was relentless consistency in high production from a player who just hadn't done it on the regular up to last year, had he?
No, and I will admit I was very wrong on him. I wonder if I'm still a little bit down on him, to be honest. I mean, I don't know how, looking at his stats and things, but yeah, I still think there's a chance he might be he won't necessarily have quite the same season he had last year. So he's a fascinating receiver, really, to look at. It was his breakout season last year, really, in his first season in Dallas. He's no longer that boom or bust deep threat, which really he'd become in Pittsburgh. But he's being drafted as a weekly fantasy starter. I think in a league I was in, I took Lamb, and I think someone took him like a pick or 2 after I'd taken Lamb, which was quite an interesting pick. If we look at 2025 for him, 93 receptions, 1,423 receiving yards, 9 touchdowns, finished as a fantasy wide receiver 1, so within that top 12. And he proved he could thrive alongside CeeDee Lamb rather than being overshadowed by him, which I think we see in a lot of those kind of wide receiver duos. His production remained strong even when Lamb was healthy, because we thought there'd be a drop-off at that point, which has really sort of silenced some people's concerns about him as a secondary option. Typically drafted as a wide receiver 10 or the wide receiver 14, so he's going in rounds 3 to 4. He's considered high in wide receiver 2 with wide receiver 1 upside. I think it's a fair statement about him. Is he the strongest wide receiver 2 with realistic wide receiver 1 upside, Mark? That's my question I would ask you.
Yeah.
And can they support both of them?
I do think they can. I think you look at a passing volume. We can talk about their breakout running back last year, but they are designed to pass the ball. They are designed to have those high touches. I do think they can support that. I think it's unlikely they are both top 12, but there is absolutely, if they are both on the field all season and you then factor in other injuries, they're the most surefire bets to 2 top 12 receivers on the same team.
Yeah, it's a fair statement.
Next up is a player who I had loads of last year. Talk about tight end values. He was one for me, and someone I targeted absolutely everywhere. And up until week 7, I had absolutely nailed it. And then he kind of disappeared towards the end of the season. What are we thinking this year? Similar to what we've said elsewhere, can 3 targets be supported in an offense? If anyone can, it's the Cowboys, but we did see it drop off last year.
Yeah, and we've got another man to talk about as well who could still take some targets. So it's difficult with Ferguson, isn't it? I think he is reliable. He's not a league winner. He's no Bowers. He's no McBride. He's never going to attract a crazy high passing volume, but the Cowboys pass a lot. And he has a clear role in Dallas. He's obviously a trusted target with Dak. If we look at last year, operating behind CeeDee Lamb and Pickens in terms of the hierarchy, so you really didn't overshadow any of those. But as we said, Dak had that 4,500 yard passing season and those 30 touchdowns. Yes, Lamb and Pickens generated the headlines, but I think he gave some consistent production up until sort of late season. Typically, he's going drafted currently as the tight end 10 or sort of tight end 10 to tight end 12, around there. Usually select in rounds 10 or 12. And he's considered a low-end tight end 1 or high-end tight end 2, really, I think. If I'm waiting until the late rounds, I wouldn't be too upset about getting him. But he's not one of my main targets in terms of tight end.
I think what I'm still carrying is that in the leagues I did get into playoffs last year, his playoff run last year was the tight end 41, tight end 33, tight end 23. We didn't get a single top 12 week there, so that did hurt you. But it was great value through the rest of the season. So, yeah, player that I can imagine I will be taking somewhere because when he is on form, he is fantastic. A player that went at significant value, I think, last year, looking upon the numbers on there, will he repeat?
Javonte Williams. Biggest risers currently, really, if we look, as you say, from where he went, after years of inconsistency following what was a pretty horrendous knee injury, he finally looked back to sort of his old self, what he was drafted as in Denver, and he's established himself as Dallas's clear lead back. The Cowboys rewarded him with a new contract, and he's definitely going to be sort of their dominant early down back and have the majority of the goal line work. I don't think he'll be the workhorse, like Jacobs, for example. He's not going to take all of the plays, but he'll certainly be the main focus there. 2025, he had a career best season, 1,201 rushing yards, 11 touchdowns, 252 carries. He played 16 games and he finished as the RB12 in fantasy scoring. So he earned that 3-year contract from Dallas after the season. I think the most encouraging sign really is he finally showed that sort of burst of power and pace that he had before the knee injury. That had quite a significant effect on him. His current ADP typically drafted anything from sort of running back 15 to running back 20. So that's usually in rounds kind of 3 and 4. And he's viewed, I would say, as a sort of a strong RB2 with upside. And again, we talked earlier about Jacobs. But if you go wide receiver in sort of round 1 and quarterback in round 2, I think Javonte is an excellent running back to pair with those in that round 3 or round 4. He's attached to one of the best offenses in fantasy football. And he has a really realistic path to another, 1,000 yard plus season and double digit touchdowns potentially as well.
Yeah, he's a player that ADP is absolutely bang on for. If you take him, then that makes perfect sense of value. And I think you should probably see pretty much that exact return as well, in my opinion. So, yeah, another really good option. We're looking through the whole of the NFC East, and there are so many options that we want to get fancy. Who is going to take the division this year, though, Tom?
That is a real tough... I mean, I don't think it's not as close as the North. I am going to go. I'm going to say. No, not Jaden Daniels. No, the supporting cast isn't. I'm going to say Jackson Dart and Malik Neighbors take the NFC East. That's a top take.
I am going to go for finally Jezza has got it right, and his change of leadership at the Cowboys sees them take the division and have a strong playoff run this year. Surely they can do it at this stage after not doing it very well. Who knows? But yeah, I'm going to go for the Cowboys. I think that offense is so well equipped. They've got it in them. So we shall find out as we get to the end of the season. That is all, though, for our NFC East rundown. We'll be back in a few days with the NFC South. Anything to add, Tom, before we depart?